Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Trina Waters. I'm a committee member for the Association for Medical Humanities and Healthcare. Very big welcome to you all today for the first seminar of 2024 dedicated to Trans History Month. We're hugely honoured to have Zoe here, also a committee member, to present her incredible work. Before we begin, I just want to do some housekeeping rules. First and foremost, I'd like to let you know that this is being recorded today. So if it's a matter that you don't want to be made visible in the recording, kindly ensure that your videos are switched off. Equally so, for the purpose of timing, if you can stay muted until the end of the presentation, where then there will be a space then for questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to add them into the chat and we can get to them at the end. Also a huge thank you to Paula, who's been instrumental in setting up all the tech elements for this evening's event. And so very quickly, I just would love the honour to introduce Zoe. So Professor Playdon is an Emeritus Professor of Medical Humanities at the University of London. And before that, she was Professor and Head Education at the NHS Kent, Surrey and Sussex Regional Postgraduate Medical Deanery for 23 years. She is a former co-chair of the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists and co-founder with Dr Lynne Jones MP of Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity. Her award-winning history of UK trans experience, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, is currently being serialised for BBC television. So today we are very excited to be learning more about this case. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Zoe.
Okay, thank you very much, Trina. I am, as advertised, the aforesaid Zoe Playdon, and it's a great pleasure to celebrate LGBT History Month with you and to talk about the hidden case of Ewan Forbes and its impact on the trans lost generation. So, the presentation comes with a trigger warning. It does contain some descriptions of institutionalised violence against trans people, and I've dedicated it to one of the lost generation, my old friend Dr Joyce Martin, a former GP, whose partners forced her to resign from the practice when she transitioned, who was hounded by the press, and whose family dead-named her at her funeral. These are the key takeaways from this evening. Until the hidden case of Ewan Forbes, UK trans people lived in complete legal equality. After Ewan, that equality was removed, Ewan's legal case placed into the deepest secrecy, and UK trans people subjected to the combination of loss of their civil liberties, media representation as dangerous monsters, and an NHS regime which required compulsory sterilisation as a precondition for care. And the justification for this, I was told, was, and I quote, that there are some interests it's more important to protect than the rights of individuals. So it seems as though a generation of trans lives was sacrificed to political interests. So, 4 questions. How did this happen? Why does almost no one know that it happened? What was its impact on NHS trans healthcare? And where are we today? Historically then, we start in 1886, when Viennese psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis provided the first diagnostic criteria for being trans, which he called metamorphosis sexualis without paranoia, classifying it as intersex, a natural diversity of sex development. Writing for the criminal courts and condemning gay men and lesbians as diseased degenerate inverts, Krafft-Ebing gave trans people a free pass, provided patients gave a history that met his diagnostic criteria and obeyed his so-called law of the homologous sexual development, the fantasy that in undiseased people, sex, sexuality and gender would always be cis-heteronormative. Trans lesbians and trans gay men were supposed not to exist, and non-binary hadn't been thought of. Well, Krafft-Ebing's diagnosis and criteria was supported by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1910, who gave us the term transvestite, continuing to separate being trans from homosexuality, fetishism, and sadomasochism, arguing that the sex of the person lies more in the brain than in the genitals, as he said, and that individuals should be able to self-determine their sex. But the big debate wasn't whether trans existed as a separate medical category, but whether actually everyone was somewhere on a spectrum between the false binaries of male and female. And in 1913, Havelock Ellis here argued for this universal bisexualism, as it was called. And that fluidity of sex seemed to be confirmed by endocrinological experiments, which resulted in 1925 in the production of progenon, an orally active formulation of estrogen. Well, the new discipline of endocrinology embraced trans healthcare, and in 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld opened his groundbreaking Institute of Sexual Sciences in Berlin, providing trans-affirmative endocrinology and surgery, until its destruction by Nazis on the 6th of May, 1933. But by the 1930s, being trans was established as a matter of medical fact, and following the rules established by Krafft-Ebing's brought legal and medical support. So Lily Alves' 1933 Man into Woman biography, which is an example of what I term first wave trans activism, actually signposted trans women to surviving in the medical system by giving a medical history that matched the diagnostic criteria and cishet ideology of Krafft-Ebing's typical patient narrative. And this, you can see here the way the discourse worked, the way in which Krafft-Ebing gave his criteria for childhood, and Lily Alves followed it in a discourse of confining stereotypes, which actually still shapes thinking about trans girls today. But in the 1930s, the main focus wasn't at all on trans girls and women. The main focus was on trans men. And this was stimulated by publicity about the Czech runner, Zdeněk Kubka, Belgian cyclist Willy de Bruyn, and British javelin and shot putter Mark Weston. They all hit the headlines. And the view was that on the whole, there were more trans men than anything else. In the UK, the clinical approach to trans healthcare remained treating it as an intersex condition, as surgeon Lennox Broster did. So that, like trans man Dr Michael Dillon, UK trans people could self-identify, access affirmative elective medical care, correct natal birth certificates to their real sex, and live in complete legal equality. And as I say, at that point, there was believed to be a high incidence of trans boys and men, trans girls and women were regarded as a rarity, and obviously the real issue was one of visibility, not real incidence rates. Anyway, this is the world into which trans man Ewan Forbes was born in 1912, and the clinical path he followed. His family's wealth and connections enabled him to travel to the continent to access early endocrinology in the late 1920s, so he didn't go through the wrong puberty. He studied at Aberdeen Medical School, became a GP in his local town of Harford, corrected his birth certificate, as everyone could in those days, and married in 1952. Now, up till then, running in trans medicine had been made by Europe. especially by Germany. But now the US suddenly leapt into prominence. Ewan's birth certificate correction was published in Time magazine in September 1952, and 9 weeks later, the New York Daily Times reported Christine Jorgensen's return to the US. And in 1953, Christine Jorgensen published her story in American Weekly in 5 installments. So the public eye shifted from the male trans athletes to trans women via the birth certificate correction of Ewan. In the same year, 1953, endocrinologist Harry Benjamin gave his landmark lecture to the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy on transsexualism and transvestism as psychosomatic and somatic psychic syndromes. And it's at this point that being trans is separated into those two distinct medical categories. And Benjamin made his distinction by saying, and I quote, "While the male transvestite enacts the role of a woman, the transsexualist wants to be one and function as one, wishing to assume as many of her characteristics as possible, physical, mental, and sexual." So we have this very clear division. So both the public and the medical eye has shifted from trans men to trans women. And this refocus is encouraged in the US by Edward's short film, Glen or Glenda, and in the UK by the publicity given to Roberta Cowell, who, like Ewan, had corrected her natal birth certificate and who, after being outed by the Sunday People, published her story, first in the Picture Post in 7 installments and then as a book, in which she mentioned, quote, "a Scottish doctor, previously a woman, who was now a man." This was Ewan. Well, Ewan, meanwhile, was living a perfectly happy life. There he is with his dog Bran and his wife Patty. And his life was uninterruptedly happy until his brother died in 1965, and he was next in line for the family baronetcy. That title was and still is limited by male primogeniture, the law that still today prevents women from inheriting certain aristocratic titles and estates, effectively making daughters non-existent in this son preference system. And as a doctor, this primogeniture ruling worried Ewan a great deal. Now, why was that? Well, as Ewan was settling into married life, in 1955, at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the US, psychologist John Money set out to solve the problem of surgeons correcting the genitalia of intersex babies into the wrong binary sex and the potential legal repercussions of that. Well, instead of the obvious measure of leaving the children alone and letting them decide later, Money and his colleagues invented the medical ideas of gender identity, and a gender gate that swings to and fro somewhere. And he claimed that if a child was properly nurtured, they would pass through this gender gate on the right side and become cis, heterosexual, and normal. Money argued that surgeons could do as they saw fit with intersex neonates, therefore, because appropriate parenting would decide gender. He was simply just reprising Kraft Evans' law of the homologous sexual development, but as nurture, not nature. So on this basis, if children turned out trans, it was the fault of the parents, probably the mother, not the surgeons. And in that case, there was a solution. In 1962, psychiatrist Robert Stoller opened the first gender identity clinic at UCLA, where he and Richard Green cured so-called inadequately nurtured trans and gay people with medical conversion practices. And as Joan Meyerowitz points out in her important book, a turf war broke out between endocrinologists such as Harry Benjamin and psychiatrists such as Money Green and Stoller, and Psychiatry 1. Trans people were medically reclassified from being intersex. Now, they were put in the same category of mental illness as gay men and lesbians. In 1969, Money and Green reasserted their idea of appropriately gendered nurture in transsexualism and sex reassignment, which became a key text for the medical management of trans people. And in the same year, they led the first international symposium on gender identity in London, specifically to import their pseudo-medical florid psychosis model to the NHS. And this meeting was the first of what's now the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And if you've got a strong stomach, you can listen to its proceedings at the USC Digital Library. By 1970, NHS adult trans health services had been centralised to Charing Cross Hospital under the leadership of John Randall as a project, as he put it, to breed out of our inheritance those potentially dire consequences for trans people, and especially for Ewan Forbes. When he corrected his birth certificate to marry in 1952, he was medically intersex. But now, in 1968, he was reclassifiable as a floridly psychotic lesbian. You'll recall that the family title Ewan was in line for was limited by male primogeniture. It could only be inherited by the next male in line. And legally, since his birth certificate had been corrected in 1952, that was Ewan. But the tide had been turning against trans people throughout the 1960s, and the press picked up on the legal problem created by medical reclassification. Even so, that on its own wasn't necessarily a problem. Ewan was legally male, and anyway, he could just have let the title lie dormant and go to the next person in line. But the next person in line, his cousin, John, challenged Ewan legally for the title on the grounds that Ewan wasn't what he called a real man. Now, if John did get the title, right, that would be tantamount to saying Ewan was a floridly psychotic lesbian, not a man. Ewan's marriage would have been illegal, and he and his wife Patty liable to 2 years imprisonment each for perjuring themselves to marry illicitly. So dramatic events follow: blackmail, family betrayal, a secret letter, sudden death, and outrageous court proceedings. And you'll have to read the book or wait for the BBC TV serialisation of it for the detail of that. But in December 1968, Ewan won the title and caused a constitutional crisis. The monarchy was limited by male preference primogeniture. We only had a queen because there were no eligible males. And British constitutional law is all about ensuring political stability by securing succession to the throne. But now, if a trans man could inherit a primogeniture baronetcy, a trans man could be king. You might think you knew who the heir to the throne was, but an older sibling, assigned female at birth, might be trans and claim it instead, or the heir, assigned male at birth, might be trans and no longer eligible. So the powers that be decided something had to be done, and the first answer was to remove all records of Ewan's case from the public eye and swear to secrecy everyone involved in it so that it could never be used as a precedent by other trans people. And when I was tipped off about the existence of an anonymous case, it took me 2 years and the direct intervention of the Home Secretary to get the case papers released. The second answer was to create a show trial using the divorce proceedings of well-known trans woman April Ashley and the son and heir of Lord Rowland, Arthur Corbett. The case of Corbett versus Corbett, which was heard by Lord Justice Roger Ormerod between 1969 and 1970, formalised the UK's new anti-trans project. April had gone through a ceremony of marriage with Arthur Corbett, but the relationship hadn't worked out. Arthur hadn't given April the villa in Marbella that he'd promised her. I mean, we've all been there, let's face it. And her solicitor, Terence Walton, advised her to sue Arthur for maintenance. Arthur's response was to sue for divorce on the grounds that April wasn't and never had been a real woman, just as Ewan's cousin had attacked him as not a real man. Well, April's case is so full of anomalies that it's obvious that she was set up. For whatever reason, she never would talk about it. April hadn't corrected her birth certificate, and so there was no legal marriage and no legal basis for claiming maintenance. And even if April didn't know that, her solicitor, Terence Walton, must have done, so his role in this was deeply suspect. Similarly, Arthur could just have ignored April's claims. No marriage, so no claim. So his suing for divorce was very strange. And what's more, the judge, Lord Ormerod, had just heard another case of a trans marriage where the birth certificate hadn't been corrected and had immediately dismissed it out of hand as no legal marriage, so no need to divorce. Why didn't he do the same for April and Arthur? Why did he order medical tests and send them back for a different result when they said April's anatomy was identical to every other woman's? Anyway, at the end of 17 days of court hearing, Ormerod faced the problem that there was, is, and never can be a scientific or medical definition of so-called binary biological sex. So, acting completely outside his competence, suppressing senior medical advice and scientific evidence, Ormerod's judgment created some absurd tests and a factitious definition of biological sex, which legally imposed on medicine new clinical guidelines for trans healthcare. And perhaps the most bizarre part of it was his obsession with April's vagina, which he was at pains to disauthenticate, claiming its use by a cis man was the same as sodomy. Anyway, out of all of this mess, Ormerod redefined April and all trans people legally as mentally ill homosexuals. And that decision and its basis became a super precedent, utilised and cited internationally across the world to discredit trans people worldwide. Suddenly, invisibly, without any debate in Parliament or any new legislation being passed, trans people could no longer correct natal birth certificates and consequently lost their civil liberties. Rights to employment, marriage, and adoption were removed. Driving licenses were secretly coded to show police and others in the know that their holders were trans, and custodial sentences were served in the wrong sex prison, where trans women were routinely raped by inmates and warders alike, without it counting legally as rape. So it was a terrifying time to be trans. People with corrected birth certificates melted invisibly away, fearful that they might be reclassified. Those without, shocked and unable to make sense of the new environment, were supported by what I've termed second wave trans activism. In 1974, the University of Leeds hosted the first National Transgender Conference to share understandings of these newly imposed legal, medical and social sanctions against trans people. Drawing on community expertise from new community groups such as the Transsexual Action Organisation and the Self-Help Association for Transsexuals. So UK trans people were now culturally isolated, outsiders, and these guides focused on survival in the newly hostile environment because staying alive, not being beaten, raped, or killed by strangers in hate attacks that were never investigated or even recorded by the police. To stay alive meant assimilation and secrecy. Medically, Charing Cross GIC's unregulated, brutal, abusive system required patients to earn their health care by complying with any and all arbitrary demands of their psychiatrist. They had to endure humiliation and belittlement and agree they were mentally ill. Treatment was refused or ended for not having paid employment. Lose your job, you're kicked off the list. For not being obedient enough, or for not looking feminine or masculine enough in the opinion of the psychiatrist. And the end point of this regime was compulsory sterilisation. If you showed any concern about this, you were wavering and would be ejected from the programme. And typically, after preparation for theatre and just before pre-med, parents were required to sign a declaration of their mental illness as a rationale for surgery. No signature, no surgery. It was a coercive system from start to finish. And this coercion was possible because trans people had a high dependence on medicine for protection from cis-normative legal standards, demonstrated by these passes issued by clinicians from Magnus Hirschfeld in 1930s Germany, Harry Benjamin in 1950s US, and Russell Reid in 1990s UK. Now that protection became a tyranny, with Charing Cross GIC coercively controlling every aspect of trans lives. And this coercive regime was consolidated in 1979 by using the former gender symposia as the basis for creating the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, subsequently renamed Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare. It established standards that were contradictory, perpetuated psychiatric abuse, and its aim, as one of its presidents said, was to protect clinicians from professional, legal, or ethical scrutiny. And you can see the results of this in action on BBC iPlayer. John Randall from Charing Cross speaking to Julia Grant in the 1980s in the BBC series A Change of Sex. And his brutality shocked even the Daily Telegraph. So for the lost generation, interactions with officials in welfare, employment and medicine became ordeals of death naming and misgendering. Social ostracism was brutal. Expect to lose friends and families. Expect to be expelled from churches, barred from leisure clubs, banned from sports. Expect to move out of your home, change your job, go somewhere you're unknown. Never tell anyone about your past. Never get in trouble with the police. And never expect understanding or sympathy. And we have no record of the number of people who survived this regime because trans people were so abjected, so excluded, they weren't even part of the public health record. And the uncomfortable historical truth is that where you've got that combination of legal exclusion, medical sterilisation and social ostracism, then the historical term we give to that is genocide, biological and cultural extermination. This is really very dark stuff to consider. And concurrently, public history, in the form of a raft of sensationalized shock horror narratives, peddled trans people as predatory masqueraders. I mean, this is happening again now, today. Toxic red top journalism touted so-called sex change secrets with before and after photos. Transploitation films, such as Dr Jekyll and Sister Hyde, showed trans people as monsters. Dressed to Kill had Michael Caine portraying trans people as insane murderers. And the award-winning Crying Game initiated the Trans Panic Defence for physically assaulting trans women, since it was considered reasonable that cis people would literally vomit when they came aware of their existence. Returning to the lost generation, this legal status quo was deemed to be unchallengeable. Legally, the so-called Wednesbury test meant that it wasn't unreasonable for employers to dismiss trans people. And without employment, trans people didn't have the means to live. What's more, the equal misery argument meant that provided employers dismissed all trans people, there was no redress. To bring a successful case for sex discrimination, a trans woman would have to show that the same organisation was continuing to employ a trans man in a similar position. This is the so-called third-party comparator. Was that if you sacked both trans men and trans women, they were equally sacked and equally miserable. And so equality law hadn't been breached. It was more or less impossible to find a third-party comparator. In the case of a trans woman, a trans man doing the same job as you but being treated more favourably. And anyway, all the employer had to do was to sack the trans man employee, and the equal misery requirement was met. This was viewed as utterly cast iron and completely unbreakable. But a new wave of trans activism was in the air. Mark Rees had tried to restore trans birth certificate correction by taking the UK government to the European Court of Human Rights in 1986, and Caroline Cossey had done the same and also failed in 1991. But these attempts introduced third wave trans activism, in which lawyer Stephen Whittle played a pivotal part, joining with other trans activists to form the trans lobbying organisation Press for Change. Operating purely on a voluntary basis, with activists funding themselves and working in their spare time to raise awareness and using legal expertise to take cases to court. Meanwhile, European understandings of trans medicine were changing. The UK's first service for trans children and adolescents had been founded by Dr Domenico De Celi at St George's Hospital in London in 1989, while best practice in European trans healthcare was located at the Free University in Amsterdam, making them the logical locations for landmark conferences in 1992 and 1993. By then, too, in 1994, I'd co-founded the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity with my colleague Lynne Jones MP, and we wrote a short pamphlet, well, I wrote a short pamphlet, Transsexualism, the Current Medical Viewpoint, setting out a biopsychosocial basis for being trans, and signed by an international leadership in the field, including John Money and Richard Green, who were recanting a bit, but directly countering the florid psychosis pseudo-medical narrative. Press for Change published the paper version, and we also published it on the internet, courtesy of London's first internet cafe, Siberia, which had just opened, because it was going to be used in a new, innovative legal case. The case involved a trans woman, P, who was offered a massively improved contract by her employer, S, which he then withdrew when she told him she was trans. And after a period of extreme bullying, in which he told P he'd prevent her from ever working again, S dismissed her. The Wednesbury test and equal misery arguments meant that S believed there'd be no legal comeback on him whatsoever. He was sound as a pound. But in fact, P thought of an argument that was radically new at the time. Instead of this third-party comparator, this fictitious, impossible to find trans men whom S had treated more favourably, she proposed herself as the comparator. When S thought she was male, he treated her very favourably. When she told him she was female, he dismissed her. And it seems an obvious argument now, but it was quite new at the time. And the case won at Industrial Tribunal in 1993, and then in the European Court of Justice in 1996. And it rewrote human rights law internationally, because as a European case, it not only affected every European state, but it could be cited in other continents as well. The ECJ recognised and articulated a fundamental principle of equality in democracy. As Advocate General Tesoro puts it, the irrelevance of a person's sex with regards to the rules regulating relations in society. It shouldn't matter what sex you are. In democracy, there should be equality regardless of sex. And with the Wensbury test and equal misery legal arguments destroyed, it was then relatively straightforward for us to use the P arguments to take the UK government to court in Europe and remove the ban on lesbians and gay men serving in the military, and thus ultimately in any other form of employment. So from then to 2019, there was reasonable progress made in restoring the civil liberties, human rights that had been deliberately removed from trans people in 1970 through a series of legal cases, acts of parliament, and new regulations. And that's an important distinction to bear in mind, I think, that whereas lesbians and gay men were seeking new civil liberties, new rights they hadn't had before, trans people were and are seeking restoration of rights they had that were removed in 1970. Even so, medicine wasn't keeping pace with social change, especially at Charing Cross GIC, as the 2013 #TransDocFail action showed. We'd still got this really very bizarre, outdated mindset going on there. Of course, the people there had been trained by John Money and regarded him as, their fount of wisdom. And so in a way, it's unsurprising that out-of-date practice hadn't been changed. So, where does this leave us today? Well, all of the great and good, the General Medical Council, the British Medical Association, a raft of medical royal colleges provide supportive, affirmative guidance and training resources for GPs and hospital consultants, but still there are constant reports of GPs failing to provide adequate care for trans patients, and centralised services for adult trans care in England are in crisis. These are the official waiting times for adult care, very far from the 18 weeks government maximum. And anecdotally, patients think it's probably going to take 20 years from referral by a GP to final completion of their patient pathway. It's obviously inadequate. Child and adolescent services are in an even greater crisis. This is a really, right now is a really dark time for trans children and their parents. On the other hand, it doesn't have to be like this. Adult care in Wales is very different, as these slides from my colleague Jen Annie Bishop show. Since 2020, Wales has had a spoken hub model. GPs refer patients directly to the central red hub of Welsh Gender Services, which carries out assessment. And typically, for non-urgent patients, there'll be a 12 to 15 month waiting list, then 2 to 3 appointments at 3 to 6 month intervals. After assessment, the red centralised hub hands over the patient to the orange spokes specialised local gender teams who care for the patient until their endocrinology stabilises, which does generally, typically over a year. And then they're discharged from the spokes to the wheel, so to speak, the yellow wheel, to a local enhanced services GP who is specially trained in trans healthcare as an aspect of their role. If reconstructive surgery is required, then at present referrals have to be made to NHS England, and then you're back in your waiting list. But otherwise, patient care is generally carried out by their GP with special expertise. So trans health is making progress, at least in Wales. And of course, the big question is, why is it making progress in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well? Meanwhile, in England, the role of general practitioners is still very uneven. Lots of GPs and their patients are unclear about their roles and responsibilities, as laid out in GMC, BMA and NHSE guidelines. And there's a real need for every GP, and for that matter, every patient, every trans patient, at least to be aware of these 8 bullet points. And I know, obviously, I know that general practice is run off its feet. But 8 bullet points, that's the key information. And that would, every GP follow those 8 bullet points, it would make trans people's life a heck of a lot easier. There are similar concerns around end-of-life care for trans people, especially for the lost generation. This is the generation from 1970 to 1996 that's been subject to a lifetime of medical abuse, social ostracism, and legal outsidership. Going into the care of medicine is terrifying at the most vulnerable stage of your life. And these are some of the real life experiences of end-of-life care. And so it's not surprising that amongst elderly trans people from the lost generation, conversations about the best way of carrying out self-euthanasia are not uncommon. So, where are we now on transhuman rights? Well, first of all, the Ewan Forbes problem, male primogenitor, was removed from the Crown in 2013, but all attempts to remove it from peers have failed spectacularly. 6 bills in 7 years, all squashed as soon as they saw light, by people who believe, as my informant put it, that their interests are more important than the rights of individuals. Secondly, by 2018, a new wave of anti-trans lobbying groups had formed, coalitions of creationists and conspiracy theorists, using social media to spread misinformation, manufacture doubt, troll trans people and their supporters, and propagate slurs of masquerade, sexual predation, and regret. Third, the gradual restoration of trans equality, which we'd been carrying out from 1996 onwards, was ended politically in July 2019 when Boris Johnson shelved Theresa May's government's LGBT action plan and dissolved the group which had produced it. In September 2020, his Minister for Women and Equalities, Liz Truss, refused the recommendations of a public consultation on reforming the Gender Recognition Act to restore greater equality and autonomy to trans people. And in April 2022, government said that any ban on conversion practices would not include trans people, and last December issued new guidance to schools that reduces trans kids' autonomy. So, dark times politically. Funding for these kinds of anti-trans ideology, so the European Parliament says, is coming from far-right political and religious groups in the US and Europe, especially Russia, at a rate of $70 million a year. And that is a lot of money when you think that, you know, the other side, as it were, trans community groups, are either doing voluntary work or they're operating on a shoestring as a charity. So there's a big political pressure, and we all know that the focus is on women's gender rights, that trans people are being used as a wedge to try to get rid of women's rights to contraception and termination of pregnancy. So when the Tavistock Clinic here, Bell case, emerged, it was pretty obvious instantly that what they were trying to do was to get rid of the so-called Gillick competence test, which allows doctors to prescribe to adolescents, to prescribe contraception to adolescents, or for adolescents to be able to get terminations of pregnancy without parental knowledge or consent. And we thought at the time, since this was all coming from the US, that they'd probably got Roe versus Wade in their sights. And of course they did have, and broke it. So this is what is at stake in human terms. When we talk about conversion practices, these things that lords are still debating, you know, should we or shouldn't we ban them? This is what they are. There are listed the kinds of things that happened and happen in pseudo-medicine. And for the practices that are not accessible in the UK, faith groups, we know, fund children and adolescents being sent abroad, often to Hungary or the Caribbean, for these kinds of conversion practices. And they are torture. So the message of the book was that, you know, trans rights are everyone's rights. Until we're all equal, none of us are equal. And as the book shows, and as the case of trans people demonstrates, anyone's rights can be removed in an instant. What's been done to trans people could be done to any of us or our loved ones. And so the message is, it's everyone's job to fight for trans equality. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you so much. That was truly remarkable, and so pivotal to shed light on this history, because it's so active now. A huge thank you for this. I think equally so, and as you noted, as well as a trigger warning, and I know that was a heavy topic. If there's anyone that would like to come to the floor, if they have any questions, please don't hesitate. Equally so, if you wanted to write your question in the chat, the floor is open to our audience at the moment. For me, if it's okay, I might just pop in if that's okay, just to ask. Essentially, even for my own experiences, I feel very privileged to be able to attend these kind of seminars and get more visibility on this history and acquire a sense of that context. I guess especially with Ewan's case being awarded a series now, I think for the general public, and I think it follows on from your final slide, what are the main takeaways that you'd wish for the public to learn about Ewan's case in particular? And in turn, what you hope if it can act as a catalyst, and how that could be the case.
Yeah, I know the main takeaway is, I think it's the thing that surprised everyone, including most, if not all, trans community members, is that before Ewan, you know, trans people self-identified, accessed affirmative elective medical care, corrected natal birth certificates, and lived quite unproblematically with full legal equality, just quietly getting on with their lives, just like Ewan did. Now, okay, there was inequity, of course there was, before 1948 in the NHS. There was inequity in access to services, but the services were there, the legal rights were there, you know? And that the change came about not because scientific medicine decided to reclassify, but because the law imposed new sets of standards and guidelines on medicine. It was effectively the law that told medicine that now it had to treat trans people as being probably psychotic, like homosexuals. You know, this is very problematic. Medicine never does well in a court of law because courts of law are all about either or, in a kind of a binary yes or no, and medicine's all about maybe, and it depends, you know? And it's a really good example of where things went very, very badly wrong. So I'm hoping that, I was hoping with the book and I hope with the TV serialisation, that what people can see is the story unfolding. And it is a lot, you know, I mean, thank you, audience, for sticking with it, because this stuff is a lot to take on board and it's pretty dark stuff. And I think the only way in which a general public can kind of cope with it without bouncing off it, as it were, is to see it carried through as a story about, you know, an English country doctor who fell in love, got married, lived his life, and all was well until suddenly, you know, this title came along and he knew that he was now in legal and medical jeopardy and that effectively his and his wife's life could be absolutely ruined unless he took measures. And of course, the measures that he took saved Ewan and Patty, but they had the unintended consequence of causing a constitutional crisis, and the solution was, well, as you know, see, a removal of civil liberties, social ostracism, and this new brutal NHS regime. And I think seeing that laid out as a story and following one person through is really helpful. I hope so anyway.
Certainly so. Absolutely. I see, Bruce, you've your hand up if you'd like to take the floor.
Oh, hi. Zoe, thank you so much for that presentation and making it so understandable for me. I bought and read your book 8 months ago, I think it was, and it's a cracking good read. And I read it in 3 or 4 days, really, and it's a superb book. It really is.
Thank you.
I suppose what not worries, and I totally fully accept that trans exists genuinely, and that all trans people should be treated completely equally. There's no question about that. What I suppose worries, the average member of public are people who claim to be trans, but who we suspect are doing so by, like, for example, men claiming to be trans women in order to gain access to private spaces. How do we guard against that? And presumably you would wish to find these people and guard them. How do we discover the false trans, as it were?
Well, I think it's a bit of a rats under the beds argument, to be quite honest, Bruce, especially the gaining access to women's spaces thing, because where are they, these women's spaces, and what happens in them? Well, what is there? There's public loos. Well, you know, if you were a cis man who wanted to gain access to a woman's public toilet, you certainly wouldn't go through all the bother of pretending to be trans. you'd just buy yourself a mop and a bucket and a high-vis jacket, wouldn't you? And go in there and pretend to
Well,
be a cleaner.
you could put a wig on, declare in the morning that you're a woman. I mean, that's what
Well, it'd be much easier just to pick up a mop and bucket
that's the
and go
impression
in.
that we have. You can simply declare yourself a woman without having to do anything
Oh no, you
more than
can't.
that.
I mean, that's not legally possible. That's not legally available in the UK. You can't.
But that
You see,
yeah,
it's
I
a bit
accept
like,
that's not true, but that is the impression that we have.
I know, but this is the result of this campaign of misinformation. You'll see similarly people saying things like, oh, well, you know, you could end up at 13 or 14 years old having a double mastectomy. But no, you can't. Not in the UK. It's illegal, you know? There's all this misinformation that's really, you know, strongly anti-trans. And there's actually nothing that's said really about trans people that hasn't been said in the past about lesbians or gay men, especially gay men. You know, gay men pretending to be straight so that they can get access to male private spaces and, you know, wreak their wicked will on unsuspecting straight men. It's just exactly the same phobic set of attitudes, or, you know, in the same way, lesbians. I mean, to be perfectly honest, why aren't we having those concerns about lesbians going into women's spaces? Well, the answer is we used to. We did have. You know, bear in mind that lesbians were excluded from the 1960s women's movement because they were considered to be just publicly too difficult to deal with. So it is just.
Sorry, are you saying it's in effect it's a myth and doesn't really exist and it's just been exaggerated?
It is a myth and it doesn't really exist. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's all made up. It's Reds under the beds, fifth columnists, the Lavender Menace.
Okay.
You know, it's all of that stuff.
And thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
And thank you, Zoe, for that. And Bruce. Any other questions at all? I think for me, and I'd say, but yeah, I think I speak on behalf of the room essentially. Zoe, what you've done is truly remarkable. Your history and your activism, it's literally saved lives, and it will continue to do so. Thank you so much for shedding light on such a pivotal and current topic, and hopefully with this work it will continue to spread awareness and knowledge, and in turn make life safer and more accessible for all. It's, as you said, nobody's equal until we're all equal, and I think that's a really, really important message to hone in on. I'd like to just open the floor in case anyone may have one final question or two, and from there then, Joe.
Thanks, Trina. Thanks, that was just amazing. It was just so beautifully put together, and as Bruce said, so you know, so accessible, but so important to trace that history. And I suppose this is a half formulated question early on a Melbourne morning. I suppose I wondered about the sort of, I don't know, the politics of collectivity, in the sense of whether you see and in what ways we might be able to work towards collective. When you make the point about equality, I mean, in terms of trans rights being the fight for everyone, whether do you think there are any affordances in terms of joining forces with other political, I'm thinking about rights more broadly, I'm thinking about racism, or
Yes, I mean,
particularly I'm thinking about racism, but yeah, just
no.
wondered about what you think about sort of a collectivist political approach.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, again, part of the attack, the anti-trans project, is to try to separate trans out from absolutely everything else, you know? And there is a vulnerability there in the queer community. You know, when we won the P case in Europe, we immediately transferred it to lesbians and gay men But at that time, it's again sobering to realise that when we went to Stonewall to do that, Stonewall in those days was extremely transphobic itself, and really didn't like the idea that it was going to use trans law to produce gay and lesbian equality. And it wasn't until Ruth Jones, now Baroness Ruth, became chief exec that Stonewall came on board and started to support trans issues equally with lesbian and gay. So that collectivity in the queer community, I think, is terribly important. But there are also, very obvious intersections with race. After all, this horrible language that's used of passing and stealth and so on is inherited initially from, slavery was abolished in the US initially for African Americans who were indistinguishable physically from Europeans, and later on for Jewish people who were indistinguishable from Aryans in 1930s Germany, and so on. And we see this constant intersection of race and gender and sexuality. And there's another interesting intersection too between the Christian evangelical world, or the faith world in general, and trans, so that this wonderful new generation of youngsters, fourth wave trans activists, I call them in the book, are really engaging with this stuff. There's a really interesting thing called Gender Heretics. I think it's Rebecca Jane Morgan, who is herself an evangelical Christian, and who is making the case that you can actually be trans and an evangelical Christian, because it is an awful lot of the conversion practices are done by fundamentalist faith groups. So there's a growing communality. The problem at the moment seems not to be, some of it's medical, and we wonder why, given the closure of Tavistock Child Services after the Cass report, we wonder why new services haven't been provided, given that there's a whole division of the NHS that's devoted to service reconfiguration, which is something we do all the damn time, So why isn't that happening? We wonder why it's acceptable to have a 6-year waiting time for trans healthcare and only an 18-week waiting time for everything else, and why that doesn't hit the headlines every day, every week, And it seems that, and we wonder why it seems so necessary to the current administration to use trans people as a political football. So it seems to be very, very highly politicised. And certainly, I spent 5 years on the Ewan project trying to make sense of trans history in the UK. And the only reason I could come across in the end for removing trans people's civil liberties and declaring them mentally ill was to protect male line and male preference primogeniture. I couldn't find another reason, really. And so it seems as though trans people have been sacrificed to political interests and are continuing to be sacrificed to political interests. So I guess all one can say is it's a question of hanging on in there and waiting for a change in government, which it looks as though could be coming, in the not too distant future. In the UK, in the US, of course, things are pretty dire. So according to Susan Stryker over there are 530 state bills that are anti-trans. There's now a big movement, the so-called Northern Transfer of trans people and families from the southern states to the north, just as there was after the abolition of slavery. Certainly, if Trump is re-elected, then it is going to be a very, very dark time in the US for trans people. Even over here, you know, for the last 18 months, the conversations in lots of parts of the trans community have been about when would it be safe to leave? How long could you leave it before leaving the UK? And where would you go to? Would it be Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia? Because things seem to be, you know, so grim, with, you know, Prime Minister joking apparently about Brianna G's death and so on and so forth. So an unprecedented period of public political anti-trans activity, matched only really by the secret, the private, the unrecorded anti-trans activity of 1970. But, you know, at the end of the day, people are people, community wins. If people know the facts rather than all the misinformation and the myth and the nonsense and the drivel that's generally spouted hither and yon, then I think that takes people's hearts and minds. And that's my hope for the TV serialisation, is that that's what it will do. That it will be accessible to the ordinary person, and they will think, oh, okay, so we didn't know any of that. And gosh, you know, and when I wrote the book, I wanted people to fall in love with Ewan, you know, and feel for him. And I'd like them to do that with the TV serialisation too. So, you know, we continue. It's been 35 years on the front line, and it won't be another 35, I'm afraid. I shall be long gone before then. But, you know, never give up is what I say.
Zoe, thank you so much. I believe it's Andrew that has their hand up.
Yeah, need to unmute, Andrew.
Hi, Zoe. It's Alex Combs, and I'm here with my partner, Andrew. And just for context, Zoe showed my artwork in the lecture she just gave.
Nice surprise.
Yeah, that was cool. We love your book. We're so excited for the BBC series. That's so awesome. Just wanted to say hi.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you. Yeah, I love the artwork, by the way. Yeah. I love the way I stood there looking very seriously and saying, you know, this is how it was.
Yes. It's serious stuff, unfortunately.
But I think that your book too is really helpful, because again, it's about making a complex narrative accessible and understandable to ordinary people in an entertaining fashion, you know?
That's the whole idea of making it a comic, a graphic novel.
Yeah. Well, I think graphic novels are the thing, and I really look forward to yours coming out. It'd be great.
Thank you. Yes, so in 2025, we'll be putting out our graphic novel about trans history. So look for it then.
Yeah, I'll buy it.
Okay, just wanted to say hi. Thanks so much for the great presentation.
No, thanks for coming, Alex and Andrew. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Alex and Andrew. Really looking forward to that as well. That'll be fantastic. I think I'm conscious of time, and especially, oh, Carlos, sorry, Carlos, you have your hand up there. Do you want to take the floor? Or we can have this as our final question for this evening.
Sorry, thank you very much for the presentation. My question was, if I understood right, you say that this was a case in which law was, in many ways, the weight was more on the law side rather than on the medicine side.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to talk a bit about that, because my understanding is that medicine always has played the role of many biological definitions, and sex has been one. So how can one see the weight more on the law side than in the medicine side. For me, both of them carry sort of the same, if you want, consequences when they define issues like sex.
Well, it was possible. I mean, first of all, in the UK, the general rule is that the law follows medicine. And that was why, because medicine tends to keep pace with social change quicker than the law does, and that was why we wrote that little thing, Transsexualism, the Current Medical Viewpoint, because that's a powerful argument in a court of law. It was possible for a legal judgment to be imposed on medicine for two reasons. The first was that by then, by 1970, the 1969 takeover of NHS medicine by Money, Green and Randall with US pseudo-medicine had already taken place. And so we have John Randall in court giving the case for trans people being floridly psychotic. Randall, of course, at that time was, and this is one of the other odd things about the case, was at that point just an ordinary jobbing consultant at Charing Cross. And on the other side, you had like the most senior people in psychiatry saying, it's social and it's not a question of mental illness and so on. And one of the odd things is that senior medical and scientific evidence was ignored. Effectively, the same evidence that was accepted, or the same arguments that were accepted in the case of Ewan, were ignored in the case of April Ashley. And that's really one of the many strange things about the case. The other reason it was possible for Ormrod to impose his views on medicine was that he himself had had some medical training. He'd got as far as, well, what would we call it now? Probably first year, maybe second year senior house officer, first year, maybe first year specialty training before he'd packed in medicine and gone to law. And so he gave himself the airs of being a medical person who knew, well, obviously as an insider to medicine, perfectly well that that level of generalism is so hopeless, really, as to be completely inadequate when applied to a super specialty like trans healthcare. But we may know that. Nobody else did at the time. And there wasn't a political will to listen to anything else either. So, he creates this completely factitious sex test. It's based, eventually it's exploded by an Australian judge, but not until 2001, I think, in a case called Re Kevin. And the Australian judge pointed out that Ormrod's judgment was what's called sometimes in law a marshmallow. It looks solid, but it's just completely empty. And because it was based on no principles and no evidence. It was, as we'd say in research, it was an unsupported opinion. And that unsupported opinion damaged the lives of trans people, not just in the UK, but in Europe, in the US, in Canada, Australia, South Africa, anywhere, New Zealand, anywhere that an anti-science legal system was in use. Yeah. So actually getting medicine on side for the 1996 case was really important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's how it happened. That's how it went down.
Thank you.
No, pleasure.
Yeah, essentially saying a massive thank you and for sharing your wisdom. Exactly that. And Cassie as well, massively thank you. It's just to say, and I think we speak for everyone. I think what you've said in your closing remarks, Zoe, were really, really lovely. Essentially is never give up. I think this is such a pivotal statement. A massive thank you, Zoe, for the organisers, for the committee and everything. A huge thank you as well for everyone in attendance today. And we're wishing you all a lovely evening and week ahead. And again, Zoe, a massive thank you for everything. That was really a beautiful work. Well done.
Lovely to see everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.